Welcome everyone again to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. This is a series hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, along with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Training Director in the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences here in the University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, anytime that you feel comfortable. Just know that we do tend to hold the questions until the end. We try to get to as many as we can, but just forgive us if we don't get to yours. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet that will be posted in the chat box shortly after this introduction. And then those of you that are pursuing APA continuing education credits, the link for that will be in the chat box as well, near the end of the presentation. Make sure you check the chat box, make sure you open the link before you leave here to make sure it's working for you, and make sure after you complete the survey that you save your certificate after you complete it, because we don't have access to those surveys after the fact. For next week's talk in the series, we will have Dr. Jill Levinson, who'll be discussing trauma-informed care and forensic mental health practices. But let's get back to this week. I'm very thrilled to introduce you to today's speaker, who'll be discussing culturally informed work with court-involved youth. This is Dr. Tyffani Monford Dent. Dr. Tyffani Monford Dent is a licensed psychologist and the current president of ATSA. Her primary areas of interest are sexual violence prevention and intervention on the continuum, the role of intersectionality in the lives of Black and brown girls and women, racial trauma and radical healing, social justice work within the mental health profession, and culturally informed work with those in the juvenile justice and child welfare systems. Dr. Dent is interim director of clinical services for a safety net hospital in Ohio and serves on its faculty at an affiliated medical school. She's also the owner of Monford Dent Consulting and Psychological Services, through which she provides ongoing mental health consultation and assessment services. This year, she expanded her clinical practice to include therapy services with a focus on Black women and adolescents. In late 2022, Dr. Dent co-founded Living at the Intersections Incorporated, a nonprofit dedicated to the needs of Black girls and emerging adults and Black non-binary youth through the use of 4 pillars: system change, empowerment, organizational technical support, and education and research. She's been featured on local and national news programs addressing the importance of emotional wellness in Black communities, mental health in times of national crisis, and the school-to-prison pipeline's impact on Black girls. Dr. Dent, Tyffani, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, it's an honor. We're very excited to have you join this series and very thankful that you're sharing your expertise with us today. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited. There's so many of you I see on here. It's one of those things where you usually don't want to see that there's that many people, but it's great to have you all here. So today we're going to talk about culturally informed work with court-involved youth. So we can go to the next slide. One of the things we always, of course, know that we have to do objectives. So we want to kind of look at the impact of racism on client sentencing and treatment placement. We want to look at the role of experiences with racism and lack of privilege on our Black, Indigenous, people of color clients, and understand the challenges faced within our field when we're kind of addressing these issues of race, power, and privilege within the juvenile justice system. And then what does it then look like if we're trying to provide culturally informed work in meeting the needs of diverse court-involved youth? So one of the things we're going to go to is we're going to go to the next slide and talk about that we have at times struggled in having these conversations when we start talking about cultural work and we specifically focus on issues of race and ethnicity and this need for recognizing the importance of those things as it relates to culturally specific treatment and assessment services. We oftentimes dismiss it as those conversations are political, especially in the current climate where anytime we bring up issues of diversity and diverse needs of those that we serve, it's dismissed under the arena of you're being political and we don't need to have these conversations. But what I always say is interesting because when we're talking about race and ethnicity and those roles in culturally informed practices, that is a problem. But we don't seem to struggle as much when we say female clients and the services they need, the reasons why they become involved in our systems, how assessment is going to looks different from male clients. Like many of us will agree, like, yes, when I'm working, when we're talking about gender responsive treatment, that looks different. Assessment measures are normed, and a lot of times you look to see who are they normed on. And if it says the sample was only males, we don't then use them for females. Or if we do, we then put all of these caveats that must be put into place to say this may not be as valid because the gender that it was normed on is not the one that this is used for. And sometimes it just specifically says you cannot if they were not the gender that it was normed on. We are even open to identifying how faith can play a role in treatment depending upon the client. We know that there's research that's talked about those who have who ascribe to a faith or spirituality, that if we incorporate those things in service provision, that we have better outcomes, that that person, whether it is psychological outcomes or physical health outcomes. We also know that there's some research out there, sort of mixed, that's been done on juveniles who have been involved with court systems that talk about protective factors. And one of the things that they talk about is faith as a protective factor. So when we start talking about, hey, if faith matters, then we want to ask those questions, and we want to make sure that we incorporate that into services, that we acknowledge it in our assessment as a protective factor. We don't say don't have that conversation because now we're getting political. Even the American Psychological Association, shout out to all of my fellow psychologists, has identified the failures within its system related to the way it has addressed communities of color, as well as the ways it did not. So we recognize that even when it came to treatment and assessment, that APA says we at times used our assessment measures to put forth and to give legitimacy to some very false information and beliefs about communities of color, that at times our treatment methods have not demonstrated that they serve communities of color as well as they serve those in the predominant community. And so we're recognizing these things. And so we can't continue to kind of say, when we're saying, no, these questions matter, this information needs to be taken into consideration when we are looking at treatment, assessment, supervision, barriers to engagement in our services, that we can't just push it off as being political. We really have to begin to have these conversations. So next slide, please. So if we want to truly identify what impacts a client's beliefs about self, emotional health, interpersonal relationship systems, et cetera, it is good clinical work to be culturally informed. It is good clinical work to ask about how their race, their ethnicity impacts who they are, especially as it looks at how they see themselves, how society and systems see them, what relationships matter to them, and how they even begin to define what is considered emotionally healthy. So one of the things is, whether we like it or not, and we can go to the next slide, our systems are disproportionately impact communities of color, specifically when we're talking about court-involved youth. And so even when we look at these numbers, when we're talking about Black and brown folks specifically, there's higher rates of incarceration. So we're more likely to see them as it relates to disproportionate presentation within our systems. So they are going to be there. And so the likelihood of imprisonment of US residents born in 2001. So right now we're kind of looking at those who are within some of our systems may still be involved with that juvenile system, because some states, even if you can't be necessarily held in juvenile justice facilities, they can kind of extend their supervision of you into your 20s. And we know for those who have, in many states, who have been convicted of sexual crimes, registration does not end the moment that you turn 18 necessarily. And so we're looking at this idea of disproportionate representation of Black and brown folks, specifically, whether you're male or female within our systems. And so we know that this idea of, next slide, disproportionate sentencing does exist. We have to also begin to look at why. And some of the why is also how systems view who deserves compassion, how our risk measures don't necessarily take into consideration issues within specific communities. And we'll talk a little bit more about over surveilling, how that kind of impacts how much court involvement that you may have had at one point in time. So disproportionate sentencing exists, and that acknowledgement, research has demonstrated that it does, as it relates to those who have committed the same criminal acts. Or, next slide, it doesn't exist in the sense of, like, this is the lovely gentleman Rittenhouse who actually took a gun to a whole different state, and then was found not guilty. And part of it was how society was even able to say, how we even define different communities and justice involved youth. Some we call kids. They were a kid. Others we at times adultify and call them adults or young men or young women, and how that even determines within ourselves and within our systems. Language matters. And if we're defining somebody as a child and we're defining someone else as an adult, culpability ends up coming into play, grace comes into play, or consequence comes into play. So we can go to the next slide. And part of the issue is why disproportionate sentencing is a reality, because sentencing is often subjective. There are in many jurisdictions mandatory minimums. We know that. However, even in those situations where there's mandatory minimums, there's still judicial discretion in making that determination of where you're going to give that minimum or if you're going to go even further. There are also ideas of mitigating factors. And so it also, within our own biases, we also have to look at which mitigating factors do we bring up and which ones matter to systems and which ones do they dismiss as a personal problem versus a systemic issue. We also have to recognize, even when we're, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, even when we're looking at, for those of us who do assessments, are doing these reports, the language that we use to describe what's happening is often subjective. And that the words that you use, if you use one bit of language over the other, that also sends a message to the court system regarding, does this person deserve treatment? Or does this person deserve consequence? And that happens a lot of times, specifically when we're talking about our juvenile. We run into that. For example, if we sit here and say that someone is resistant versus they are reluctant to engage, how that language in our report is going to impact what probation and parole decides to do, what the prosecutor decides to do, what the jurist decides to do, what treatment interventions are going to be offered, if at all. And then also disproportionate sentencing, because we're looking at this idea of it being subjective, even as how we frame issues. We frame them as either criminal or crisis, has been impacted by who is harmed and their racial ethnic background. So we know when it came to issues of the crack epidemic, we talked about this war on drugs because it was predominantly impacting communities of color. And so if we're saying that this is a war involves punishment. There's consequences for this, that we're coming out fighting. And so in that, the thing that we did was incarcerate people, because how we framed it is because this idea of, who was impacted, who was harmed, you deserve a consequence. So then we are filling up juvenile correctional facilities, adult facilities with those who have been victims of the crack epidemic. The opioid crisis, epidemic is something that we obliterate. Crisis is something that we try to treat and that we work through, that we look at it as a problem that belongs to all of us. And so when we looked at the opioid crisis, the thing became the humanity of those who were impacted by it. And so we talked about treatment. We talk about, even if you're overdosing, which should be the case, we are going to treat that overdose and we're going to offer you treatment. Versus if you were using crack and we find a pipe on you, we are going to send you to prison. We're going to send you to jail. And so we also have to recognize that when we're talking about court-involved youth right now, they are aware of these things. And so when we kind of talk about belief systems and engagement within our system, we also have to recognize that they recognize that sentencing is subjective, and so do their families. They see and live through this idea of how when issues have impacted communities, when it's impacted their community, how has that been viewed differently from when it's impacted communities that are more of the majority culture? And so we can go to the next slide. The following statistics came from the E. Ann Carson and Elizabeth Anderson and the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And so in 2015, Blacks comprised about 13% of the population, but about 39% of all state and federal prison inmates. Hispanics were 17%, but 24% of the prison population. By contrast, non-Hispanic whites were 63% of the population, but disproportionately were less represented. And so stated another way, people of color comprise only about 30% of the US population, but we're about 2/3 of all prison inmates. And again, we have to look at part of it is systemic issues, part of it is sentencing issues. And so when we kind of look at just kind of the system, just kind of that looking a little bit more into disproportionate sentencing and subjectivity, on the next slide, one of the things that we found in a study by Lieber in 2020 was that juveniles of color were found to receive more severe dispositions over time than their white counterparts for kind of the same behaviors. So over time, even if they kind of started out equally, if they continued to get into trouble within the legal system, they began to be punished more harshly. And bias can impact how we perceive dangerousness and can come across in our report writing. Again, the idea of resistant versus guarded. How are we going to look at those differently? If someone is aggressive versus passionate about something, if we say that a child is advocates for themselves versus manipulative. And I've seen these happen within reports where I've seen the same behavior identified in these two very different ways. And what happens then, right? Aggressive is going to get you incarcerated. Passionate is going to make someone say, wow, this is a protective factor. This is great. Manipulative is going to be punishment. Advocating for yourself is going to be looked at as a protective factor and a strength. The behavior can be the exact same. And I've seen it in reports, and I've sat there and said, wait a second, the only thing that's different is the color of the child that you're referring to. And so some of it is also for those of us who are doing this work, when we're writing our reports, we need to begin to kind of check ourselves and look, my language matters. And do I know how heavily loaded these terms can be and how they can be interpreted? And for those who are actually on the other side and are the ones making the decisions around what's going to happen to this adolescent in front of me, we also have to begin to look at the language choice that's being used and ask questions. What is the behavior? If you're saying they're resistant, what are they doing? They don't really want to open up in the session with me when I was doing this interview or when they were meeting with the probation officer. So then we want to ask the questions why. And that's kind of that piece of it. And again, the next slide just talks about those mitigating factors don't count, that war on drugs versus opioid epidemic. We also talk about potential versus how we look at someone as being a thug, that we don't sit here and say this person has the potential to do amazing things. We focus on the current behaviors and then we define them as such. Or even again, the idea of adultification bias. Brock Turner was 19. He was in Ohio and he had sexually assaulted someone. And throughout all of the news stories and even in the court system, they were referring to him as a boy, which very clearly talks about level of culpability, right? If we're calling someone a boy, we're acknowledging that they are less mature, that they need more understanding, that they are more malleable, and being that ability to be able to change versus men, which we also, and I challenge many of you to kind of look at the language when news stories, articles in your court systems of the language that they're choosing. Are they choosing this language of juveniles who are all adolescents and children, or are they referring to them as men and women versus girls and boys? And with whom are they making those language choices? And then we know that there's a study by Georgetown that talks about adultification bias in Black girls and this idea that Black girls are more knowledgeable and need less nurturing and support and are viewed as being older than they actually are. And so again, if we are coming within these systems and we're looking at girls, and this was actually, didn't matter the color of the respondent, whether they were actually Black or they were a white person, they were all saying this. They had these beliefs about Black girls. And so when they are coming into these systems, and we have this belief system that goes along with this idea of they are more mature, they know, we then go into they know better, that they are more responsible for the decisions that they are making, which then again results in a likelihood of more punishment because the expectations are unreasonable and high. And so, we talk about this juvenile justice system. And one of the things that we need to acknowledge on the next slide is the justice system was not set up to protect people of color. some of the things that we know, that there was incarceration for minor offenses after Reconstruction in the United States, which was to funnel out laborers. So we know that after slavery ended and the Civil War ended, and we kind of went through this period of Reconstruction where Black people were now owning property and they were building their own businesses, developing their families, there now was a shortage of labor, because now who are going to work the fields for no wages, right? And so what happened is there started to be this process of incarcerating Black people for minor offenses. And then the way that you got out is you were then funneled out to these businesses, to the plantations that were still in operation, that they were being funneled out in order to do the labor, because now we can still force you to do the labor for free. We also know that the idea of over policing and surveilling, we know that we are more likely to see police officers within the school systems of Black and Brown children, within the neighborhoods of Black and Brown children. And so even within school districts, when we talk about engagement, that school to prison pipeline, part of it is if you have resource officers who are police officers who are in school buildings, and they're there, the goal is saying, well, you're a resource officer, you're just here to kind of protect or whatever, you're still police officers. So behaviors that in schools that do not have police officers, where discipline ends up being suspension, maybe expulsion, maybe, having to go to talk to the principal, you now have people there who have the ability to arrest you. And so we have that school to prison pipeline, that ability now for them to come and then arrest you. And so now that system is also over surveilling and over policing. And ongoing reported tension between communities of color that is starting to be filmed. We have to acknowledge, and part of this is, if we know these things, how does that inform in part how adolescents from communities of color specifically are viewing the system? Because one of the things that we try to say is, I am here to help. In juvenile justice, one of the reasons why juvenile justice was established is this recognition that children and adolescents should be treated differently, even when they engage in problematic, what we call criminal behavior in adults, delinquent acts in adolescents, that they should be treated differently. Consequences should be different. We should have this model where we truly are about rehabilitation, right? But we also still have to acknowledge that we are still dealing with adolescents who view these systems, this law enforcement system, this judicial system, as a tense relationship. So we have that being film piece, and then we add the over policing and surveilling. So things that in other communities are not criminalized are criminalized in mine, because you know what happens if you have people there to actually cite you for it, that have the ability to say it's criminal, things that aren't criminal, that no one would call the police for, right? Because there are things that happen that no one would call the police for. They might yell at you, they may tell you you ain't supposed to do that, but they're not going to take the time and energy to call the police because they even view it as minor. If the police officers are already there, then action is able to be taken. So I want to go on to the next slide, please. And I know this is a video. It's very short.
I treat the whole client. Race has nothing to do with it. I focus on the individual child.
So one of the things that happens is that even though we sit and we talk about over policing and over surveilling, that we recognize adultification, that we know that we have disproportionate sentencing that is happening within communities, that we are recognizing that the language that we are choosing oftentimes is very different depending upon who is in front of us. We still at times, when it's brought up that we need to do something different, how we assess, what assessment measures we use, how we assess, the language that we are using, what treatment looks like to be culturally informed, to kind of encompass some of these other issues that are coming in the door, kind of these belief systems, this wariness about engagement, which we'll talk a little bit more about as it relates to treatment. We then try to say, I don't need to talk about any of that, because we fall back on that I treat the individual. So if I'm sitting here and saying, I am treating just the person in front of me, and I don't have to look at the cultural implications of the person in front of me. And so and this is a friend of mine, and I always have to put out there, because she told me to put it, especially if anything is ever taped, please let them know that this is not my belief system. I just was stating this because it was a script that Dr. Dent gave me. So if you see it out there, she does not want people to think this is her belief system. But this is a belief system of many. When we sit there and we say treatment needs to look different, there are additional issues that we need to be aware of that impact the engagement of communities of color, of adolescents of color with these systems. Because at the end of the day, we're systems. Even if you are a private practitioner who's been asked to do an assessment or to do treatment, and you say, well, I'm not a part of the system. Once the system engaged you to provide the service, you became a part of the system. We try to say, I don't have to talk about any of that because I treat the individual, which is a cop out for being able to really look at how culture informs this work. And so then we need to look at, why are these reasons that we cop out of it? Why don't we want to address this acknowledgement of how the systems are set up, how culture informs the work or needs to, as it relates to supervision, familial needs, assessment, and treatment? And so the next slide tells us why we don't want to address it. We like to view the world as fair. I mean, we like to believe that everybody has the same opportunities, that, if you haven't done something wrong, you're not going to face a consequence. Or if you face a consequence for doing something wrong, that you will face the same consequence as anybody who does it. Many people get within these systems sometimes to fix the systems, but also there's this a lot of times a belief in this system, that this system is trying to get it right and that we're trying to be a part of the solution. I don't know many people in the system who are like, this system is messed up and I believe it's going to stay messed up forever and I am here to keep it messy. Most of us even say in that moment that we believe that the world can be fair, or we like to view it as fair. And when we recognize disproportionate sentencing, when we talk about these biases, when we talk about over policing and over surveilling, when we're sitting here and recognizing, wow, the language that we're using, our own, biases are coming in and who we call resistant versus guarded or struggling to engage, those things are playing a role. We have to realize our systems aren't fair. The world isn't fair, and we don't want to talk about that. And we are also working within these systems that are being called even more harmful to our clients of color. So I had a therapist one time say, I don't like to believe I'm working within the system, but you are. And so we have chosen to work within systems that have caused harm to clients of color. And so we have to be able to address that and know that that harm has been caused, and sometimes by our reports, by the statements we've made, by the way that we've engaged in treatment or assessment, we have contributed to that harm. Just like the American Psychological Association has acknowledged that they did, our assessment measures have caused harm. And that if we really want to really be aware of and put into place culturally informed practices, we have to acknowledge that. And we work with clients who are already marginalized, so no time for addressing additional ones. So we are already dealing with juveniles who are engaged in the juvenile justice system. So that's already a level of marginalization, because when you're sitting here and you're talking about delinquency, society already has a view and has now tiered them down because they have this criminal justice involvement. And so we're like, you know what? We're already having to deal with the fact that you're involved in the criminal justice system. What does that look like for you? Some felonies for adolescents can go away in terms of you can request them to be expunged or sealed. Other ones cannot. And so we're already sitting here with you navigating the fact that you are already going to be marginalized somewhat in society, depending upon what delinquent act in which you've engaged. So we're like, I don't want to address this other stuff because I have enough stuff to address. But we don't then recognize how all of those pieces end up influencing the client in front of us. So why do we need to address it on this next slide? Because we want to fully see the humanity of our clients when others do not. Because we know when we're working with juvenile justice involved youth, there are some people who write them off. There are some people who say, just lock them up forever. Why didn't you charge them as an adult? And so to fully see our clients as full human beings and not just a juvenile justice involved youth or a delinquent, we need to look at how culture informs who they are. And although the person said, I treat the individual, individual treatment needs to fully look at the individual. So even if you're sitting here and saying, I'm holding on to this idea that individual treatment is what I do, then if it's truly meeting the needs of that client, then you have to look at all aspects of who they are that influence their perception, their ability to engage in services, their willingness to follow through with rules and expectation, the barriers that society may put into place for them to be able to do that. And the piece of it is some things that may show up for them just because of how society views their community in terms of over surveilling and over policing that may not show up for other clients. And then we want to identify further barriers that impact their engagement in our services. So we kind of have these, at times, these privileges within existing within who we are as the service providers, as the people who are on the other side of the juvenile justice. We're not the ones who are engaged as the ones the system is saying need correction. And so we have these privileges in kind of navigating the world as who we are. And for some of us, we have more than others when we look at who society values as it relates to race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender identity. And so on the next slide, it says, even within the shared removal of privilege from the clients we serve, like even if they share some of it, the role of race impacts how they navigate the system, how they see the system, and often what happens within the system for them. So I want to look at the next slide and kind of talk about this, how this shows up. I call this the boy band phenomenon. This dates me a little bit because I am a child who grew up listening to not One Direction, don't know them, that was my own children. But, you know, I was a NSYNC, I was a Backstreet Boys, I was 98 Degrees, I was that type of person. So now it's more K-pop is what I'm hearing. But boy bands, we all kind of have this idea of a boy band. And so I went to juvenile court one day and it was diversion day. So for those who don't know, diversion is this opportunity to go to do some type of programming. And if you do it, you have no record. Like you don't have the charges anymore. Finish this program. We are diverting you out of this system. So if you complete these services, it's like you were never here. So it's this level of grace. It's this level of second chances. So this was the day of diversion day. So that means all of the specialized dockets where kids who are in diversion, who are not going the traditional probation route. Because if you go traditional probation, you finish it, you still have stuff you have to do to get off probation, but your record still stands. So I was there and I called it the boy band phenomena. Because when I looked, it looked like a boy band audition. I looked around and everybody was predominantly white. Everybody appeared to be predominantly middle class or higher, even by the areas of the city. When you kind of listen to where they were from, the area of the county were very much wealthier, white, suburban. And so I sat there because I said, this looks like a boy band audition. This looks very different from traditional juvenile court days that I went to before, which predominantly were Black, brown, certain zip codes within the city. So this is how our clients are viewed, will often impact what services are recommended. So you had these suburban white kids who were all seeming to be recommended for diversion or outpatient services versus those higher level of residential or incarceration. And which the interesting thing was this idea that, well, they had more positives going on in their lives, right? How the system viewed it. But the irony is if you have all of these positives that are happening, isn't it more concerning? You know, if you're coming from this two-parent home, you're in the suburbs, you have access to a great education, you're in a low crime area, all of those things that we look at in terms of risk to do things, and yet somehow you found trouble. So to me, it's like you had to go looking for something. And yet that's the group that we're viewing as deserving diversion, which means that when they finish this, they are recommended for substance abuse treatment. My Black child over here from the city is recommended for substance abuse treatment. They can both be in the same substance abuse treatment group, but when they finish, one no longer has a criminal record and the other one continues to do so. So we kind of have to look at that. And our assessment measures may view as more concerning family dynamics in neighborhoods based upon racial makeup. We have to recognize that the idea of family is defined differently in cultures. So at times in our measures, we'll say, well, this person, they are not a part of a nuclear family. But we don't ask the questions and look at who are these extended familial supports who are positive as well, because our measures kind of ask who's in the home. Is it mom? Is it dad? Is it mom and mom? Okay, two parents, keep it moving. That's great. This other person may only have one, but then they have this extended family network of people who are either biologically related or the family has the relationship that they define as familial. And then we also know the over surveilling of Black, Indigenous people of color communities are more likely to then have familial incarceration. If police are more likely to be in a community, then crime is more likely to result in citations, in involvement, which means that we're also more likely to have that box of, has your family ever been connected or engaged in the criminal justice system? We also know that we also have kind of systemic issues where it relates to the undervaluing of land in communities of color result in less resources. They're viewed as poorer. There's less opportunities in those areas. So we're kind of sitting here and saying higher crime area, you know, more family incarceration. We're kind of not recognizing this whole systemic thing. Or one of my favorites is I've had adolescents before who were gang involved and they automatically check them as antisocial. And so I always ask, why are you in a gang? And I've had kids say, because you die if you don't. So am I going to say they're antisocial? Absolutely not. Am I going to acknowledge that they are in a gang? Yes, I need to do that. But I'm not going to automatically check the box and say they're in the gang because they're antisocial. I've had kids from suburban areas, white suburban areas, where I said, are you in a gang? They say no. And I say, why not? And they say, because we don't have any. I'm more concerned about you, but we don't then ask that extra question because our measures are set up to kind of lead us into a way of automatically interpreting information. And I make a point in my assessments to have those conversations, that although they don't reside in a two-parent household, they're able to identify these uncles, these aunts, these older cousins who are very supportive of them and are encouraging them to do better. I'm going to ask the question about gang involvement and explain, you know, why the child is in it. You have to be. If you don't, they beat you up. Still needs intervention, but am I going to view that as concerning as it relates to antisocial behavior? And so let's go to the next slide. So we kind of look at these biases even more. Biases in how we assess. The more benefit of the doubt is given to those who have privilege and those who do not, versus the expected reverse. As I mentioned, if you have access to all of these resources and all of these positive influences, and you still choose to engage in problematic behavior that's delinquent, you had to kind of search and want that more than someone that those are the glaring options. Court measures, again, identify high-risk areas as risk factors for clients, with many of these being in communities of color that are underdeveloped, and that the impact of redlining and, you know, how funding happens for our school systems and our businesses. So you're automatically something that you can't control, and that likely more contact with law enforcement. And then we also again mentioned that push out phenomenon, that idea of the school discipline court referrals to clients who are at risk. And so now you have even more on your assessment measures about, wow, this kid has been, you know, has come to the court because of concern about disorderly conduct 15 times. And then you look and say, wow, most of these were in the school when they cussed out the teacher. Where if they would have been in a school system that did not have a resource officer / police officer, would the police have been called in most of those for disorderly conduct to be given, or would it have been something that would have likely resulted in more of a school suspension, which is a school educational documentation, but doesn't show up and rise to the level of now they have 15 involvements with the court system. And so we like to look at just kind of this idea of, you know, there's privilege in how we even see systems, and that idea of how that then shows up for us and then plays a role in our willingness or lack of willingness to kind of look at the work we do to make sure it meets the cultural needs of our community. So we can look at the next slide. So we don't think about stigmas associated with mental health services. And so when we're kind of talking about this culturally informed work, we have to recognize that within many communities, there is, as soon as we're kind of talking about mental health, that there's many times where the juveniles we've come into contact with, this may be their first time engaging in mental health services, and there may be a lot of underlying needs. There's a great documentary called I'm Good Bro, where they talk to Black men who talked about depression and saying, I had these feelings, but the first time anyone ever kind of talked about it and I received services was when I was incarcerated. We also trust systems such as child welfare, and we believe that systems are designed to keep us safe. And so we kind of come with these beliefs when we're engaging with our clients, that we are given the benefit of the doubt, that services, we view them as easily accessible. Resources and assessment measures are designed or normed on people who demographically are similar to us. And then that idea of not permitting the definition of family to be outside of our own nuclear ones. And so we kind of want to start a little bit on this idea of the lack of treatment engagement through our lens. And so the next slide talks about this in the sense of failing to address an understandable mistrust of systems. So when we have clients who are coming in front of us, juveniles and their families, that we fail to talk about, that they don't necessarily trust that we are about their best interest, and that we have to be willing to talk about what this looks like. And some of this is even that idea of transparency. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but just this idea of acknowledging and not trying to negate their understandable mistrust of systems. And then we try not to be honest about the fact that we are part of the system, whether I'm your attorney or your therapist, your assessor. I am a part of this system that you are now engaged in, this juvenile justice system, because you came into contact with me because of your system involvement. And so we have to acknowledge and be honest that we are a part of this system. And part of that is then being transparent about what our role is and being honest about what information we are sharing with the court system. And so it isn't a surprise. And then our service times and court times are being based upon people having flexible work schedules. Court is from 9 to 5. Everybody doesn't have the ability to come and take half of a day off in order to bring their adolescent to court. And so when we have that, and then we view the family as resistant to, or not taking it seriously, but we're coming from this privileged lens of being able to say, well, if you have to take a couple of days or use your paid time off, when everybody doesn't have those things. And we kind of talked about that power in our word choice that shows up in our biases. And we also decide for ourselves who should be involved in client services. We don't necessarily, in a culturally informed lens, we're going to ask the adolescent, we're going to ask their caregivers, who is important to be a part of your team? Whose voices do we need to listen to? Instead, we say, who's your guardian? And that's the only person that we care about engaging or insisting should be engaged, even though there may be 2-3 other people who are highly influential in the lives of that adolescent. And then we also don't listen, on the next slide, to when we try to have these conversations, when we talked about kind of not being political, we also need to we don't listen to coworkers who actually fit within these communities or our patients. We insist that we know all clients, and again, we treat them as individuals. When someone says, hey, let's look at your word choice, let's kind of question, did you ask additional questions about why this child has 15 disorderly conducts? Did you look and see, wow, they're from school, and let me ask the school what happened? And then you look at them and say, yeah, they're 15 disorderly conducts. But most of them were because they walked out of class, which would normally be a suspension or a detention. But because a resource officer was there, it now became a disorderly conduct. And so when someone asks you the questions, we then feel judged. We get defensive. And then we're performative versus truly impactful services and outreach, that we say that we're going to do culturally informed work, but we don't then look to see, are these evidence-based interventions, have they been proven to work equally as well with Black, Indigenous, people of color clients? And I say equally as well because at times we look at research and it'll say, this has been shown to work well with this community. But then we look, but it doesn't work as well as it did with the majority community. So it doesn't mean it doesn't have some benefit, but it's like, shouldn't they all have the same benefit? So if you're like, this gets an A+ when you work with this white community, and it gets a B- when it works with, as it relates to this Black community, we then can say, yeah, they're both passing. But most of us would say, but a B- is very different. It's passing, but why isn't it at least an A? And so part of it is, do the samples even include communities of color? And then does the interventions we use, are they truly impactful services? Are we also truly impactful with our outreach to the communities that we're seeking to serve? And so we want to acknowledge our system concerns, which is the next slide. And we want to acknowledge that some systems do engage in disproportionate sentencing. We can acknowledge this while still indicating that the behavior was a problem. So if you steal my car, you still stole my car. Problem. Can we acknowledge that you stealing my car versus someone who's stealing my car, if I look at it and I can say, he got diversion for stealing my car, you got sent to juvenile corrections for stealing my car. Both stealing my car should not happen. Problem, no matter who did it. But then we also want to look at within our systems, is the sentencing showing up the same regardless of the community? And then be clear and again, honest in our transparency of being a part of that system. And so your words matter. Again, I always just keep emphasizing this because I want you to think about this on the next slide. Difficult to engage versus resistant. Who are you sending to treatment versus who are you going to incarcerate? Manipulative versus advocating for self. Who are you going to say needs to be incarcerated versus who are you going to say, wow, this is a strength? Someone has a case with children's services versus linked to other community supports. One is going to say this family is toxic, this family is criminal, this family has a lot going on, and maybe we should take this kid away, versus linked to other community services. Still children's services, but that language says this family has support. This family has someone else who is helping to monitor them and guide them through this process. And so maybe in that language difference, that's going to change what I'm going to look at in terms of supervision, what I'm going to put in place. And so again, why is addressing the impact of cultural identity difficult? Because the next slide, we believe we are doing good work and seeing our clients as individuals, but within systems that often view them through a group lens. So that is one of the things that we see them as individuals, and we should, but we also know that the system doesn't, and we have to acknowledge that. We also don't want to believe that we have our own biases. We want to say that even if this system is discriminatory and has biases, I don't. That I am about seeing the humanity in my client. Our work involves believing that people can change their lives. But when we're doing this cultural work, we recognize that we have to acknowledge that there are things outside of their control that makes it difficult for them. Doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it more difficult for them to live productive lives because of the opportunities not being as closely within their reach and society not viewing them as much as deserving of second chances. All of our clients are marginalized in some way just by engagement within this system, but we do not want to believe that some are more marginalized than others when we add these additional identities. And then we've again politicized the idea of the world not being fair and easy for some others. So we kind of want to show up some ways in this work, just kind of from this starting point. We want to look at, on the next slide, we want to make sure that we shift the role in systems. We want to challenge these disparities, right? We want to educate others on the use of the tools, research that criminalize the experiences of these juveniles who are coming in our system. So we want to kind of talk about what are these tools that we're using, and can we look at the fact that over surveilling likely impacts some of these things? Can we go beyond that first question of gang involvement and ask why? We also want to address systemic issues that impact them, racism, educational disparities, access. And we want to be present in working with challenging populations, that we want to make sure that we don't just say, I'm not going to choose to work with this community because this is too hard. In the reports that we write, in our conversations, we are also educating these systems, because it's just not about giving the facts. It's also giving context. And for many, especially defense attorneys, we know that you're always trying to educate and give context to the experiences of the adolescent in front of you. But even for treatment providers, even for assessors, kind of giving more than just this assessment measure says this, but also explaining why that assessment measure may kind of come through a more severe lens for this particular community. And then you want to make sure that the assessment measures you're using aren't harmful to communities of color when they're not harmful to someone else. And then the cultural norms, and at times challenge those that are problematic, because there are within communities messages that have been passed down that are not good ones in a way to operate within systems. And then when you're individualizing, don't use it as an excuse to not be culturally informed. And we want to make sure that the resources we use are culturally inclusive. And so what do we need to do for our clients? We want to make sure, in the next slide, that we examine the measures that we're using and take the time in our report to address concerns. It's not just enough to have a concern. You also want to say, what I want to acknowledge as I'm writing this report, this is kind of some biases that show up in this measure. Those culturally informed resources, we want to ask the clients about their experiences within our systems and go beyond their resistance and ask them why. What's kind of fueling their weariness? Outside of the norm, no one wants to be involved in the juvenile justice system. We want to acknowledge that there is a power dynamic with you and your clients, and sometimes even more so if you're from the majority culture and you're dealing with minority clients. And stop believing that our clients have the same experiences in the world as we do. We want to spend so much time arguing with them about fairness and bootstraps and all of those things that we're acting like their experiences are the same. And we want to make sure that we're talking with other people who are doing our work to make sure that our biases are not informing what we're doing. And so for ourselves, we want to make sure that the next slide, that we practice cultural humility, that we're always open to learning from our clients, that we speak up when we know that something is showing up in biases. And we want to bring these discussions back to our team, readings on issues relevant to our clients from diverse backgrounds. The biggest one for me as a Black person is not expecting those who fit within these communities to be your only source of education, that you go with them and I want to run this by you. I love can I just pick your brain? And then it's this whole conversation about explaining over surveilling and adultification bias for the next 2 hours to a colleague versus asking for resources, and not expecting only Black, Indigenous, people of color clients, staff to be the ones to bring up an issue. If you recognize that something is showing up that is likely more so impacting, for example, like the boy band phenomenon I mentioned in diversion, it should not have to be a person who's from a community of color on your staff who's the one who brings it up and says, I noticed that on the kids who seem to get diversion seem to fit a certain demographic. That should be something that everyone should bring up. And so in this, we want to look at, many of us talk about, on the next slide, trauma-informed work. And I know, and I'm excited to hear that Jill Levinson will be speaking about trauma-informed care, but culturally informed work is trauma-informed work. Like, if you're truly trauma-informed, you're going to be culturally informed, because some of those same principles that are in trauma-informed work are showing up in culturally informed work. And so trauma-informed work has these principles. On the next slide, we talk about the ideas of safety, trustworthiness, transparency, peer support, collaborations, mutuality, empowerment, voice choice, and it has cultural considerations as its own thing, right? However, I say that cultural consideration shows up in all of these other areas. And so let's look at just safety in terms of emotionally unsafe. On the next slide, they are often not viewed through a non-biased group lens. So it's oftentimes when you're coming in, you're not coming in as Tyffani or as Jonathan. You're coming in where people already have this view of your entire community. And so they're coming in with this perception and judging you by it. And oftentimes the judgment comes from all of the negative stereotypes. And emotionally unsafe, if we're not acknowledging kind of this idea for safety, is that recognizing that I know how these systems perceive this person and that this is emotionally unsafe. They may not trust the systems you do. So this isn't an emotional unsafety, because some of their trauma responses do not frame with that consideration. So when you're kind of looking at the experiences they may have had with racism, with sexism, with just all of the isms that come into play when we're looking at an intersectional identity, we don't kind of recognize that some of these experiences have been traumatic, and then how it's expressed is not the way we believe it should be. You frame their valid mistrust as resistance, and you don't even think to ask the questions or challenge what you view as obvious explanations. So we then make this an emotionally unsafe place for adolescents who are involved in this system. And then we also have to recognize the idea of how this impacts treatment. So we talk about treatment on the next slide, that we also know that they may be reluctant to engage in services. They may not be deemed in need of services, where instead the system will say they deserve to be punished, because we look at this punishment focus. The services that you do are not designed with them in mind. Even when you're sitting here talking about kind of this, where the services happen, but also what services you come up with, were they, again, we talked about gender-based. We'll say, yeah, this is girls' circle and this is this girls' program, but have you designed ones that are culturally informed? Our measures are not from a cultural lens that ensures relevance and efficacy. They're wary of you and these systems that you work in. The role of it and how this family looks plays a significant role in treatment. We talk about with juveniles, they do not exist within, by themselves. They exist within bubbles of family and school, and those things impact their success. And treatment resources and approaches need to be relevant to them. Evidence-based may not be evidentiary. And so sometimes we also have to recognize we may have to add additional resources to something and then take it away from this narrow box of evidence-based, because by itself it doesn't work for them, and add some components to treatment for them. And then we also, need to kind of look at, on the next slide, on trust and transparency. Again, this trauma-informed practice, which again, these are the things, and you saw them before, and I kind of just want to put them again in this slide. We mentioned this before, that shifting those systems, being present. This is that trust and transparency part, and how it ends up showing up as it relates to trauma-informed care. So we showed these earlier. How do I need to show up for my client? Now it's showing it again. This is trust and transparency. So the next slide. And so when we're making sure that we're doing cultural work, we want to make sure that we look at racial, cultural, historical, and other inequities that marginalize and cause more trauma, mental health issues, and impact their view of systems. So when you're looking at treatment resources and when you're engaging with clients of color, you want to kind of look at how have these things informed who they are, their engagement with this system, the reasons why they've engaged with this system, and how they respond to you. And then again, we always want to be culturally humble. We want to constantly be open to learning and being challenged in our beliefs about a community. And then the incorporation of, I always say, culturally informed healing practices, culturally informed therapy practices. So when we talk about these unique experiences, you can go to the next slide.
Dr. Dent, we are at the top of the hour, so
Okay.
I do have to let everybody know that you are at the top of the hour. You are free to go, but we will stay for a little bit for questions. One I might have is if there are any additional things you want to talk about on these slides. I'd be happy to share, because it's been a very helpful discussion, as we see from some of the comments here. Thank you so much for offering this training. Thank you for taking the time to put together so thoughtful with such great examples. If you cannot, make sure that you check the CE links before you leave. If it's not working for you right now, make sure to save that, copy it. It seems to be working okay on our end. Just got in this was so amazing with an emphasis there. But in the meantime, somebody asked,
Go ahead.
how do we best become culturally aware without such information bleeding into becoming stereotypes?
And I think that's that piece of cultural humility, is this idea of that you want to ask the questions, but not assume it fits for that person, right? Some of it is just beginning to ask. So it does not mean that, for example, saying that, oh, they're a gang member, and it must be because they feel unsafe in their community and that this is not an area of concern. You ask, why are you in a gang? And sometimes you get answers that are antisocial. And if they are, you go with that, right? But the piece of the culturally humble is, I'm going to ask the question. And so that's the piece but that cultural humility also means that when you get the answer, you listen to the answer. And so I think that's that piece of it, is sometimes we'll just not even ask, because we'll say, if he's in the gang, he's only been suspended from school so many times because they over police their school. And so then we're going to ignore the fact that they've been, have 15 disorderly conducts from school, versus we then ask about the disorderly conducts. The cultural humility piece of it is, I recognize there's over policing and over surveilling in this school. So there's sometimes things that would not rise to the level of criminal behavior that likely did because the police are there. So I'm going to look. Oh, my bad. They brought 5 guns to school and shot up the school. That is criminal behavior, right? I'm going to ask the questions, but I'm also going to listen to the answer. And sometimes we go too far. We go that other end. We don't ask because we already know the school is just, the school is just horrible. They're just horrible to Black children. And so I know those 15 disorderly conducts is the school's fault, versus I'm going to ask the cultural humility piece, and the cultural, trying to be culturally informed, is asking the question, not just assuming that these 15 are criminal. I'm going to ask. The cultural humble piece is that when the answer happens, sometimes it's going to be, wow, he cussed out the teacher. That would have never resulted in a criminal charge in another school. Oh, he brought a gun. I need to acknowledge that and then say that that is a concerning behavior. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I love that component of, the first steps certainly are thinking, acknowledging, and then asking, but then the listening piece afterwards is that crucial next step, certainly.
Absolutely.
Somebody asked, with the preface of calling this they're calling their question a loaded question, based on your response, they say, any ideas on how to introduce some of these concepts to your child's school or school district?
That's a loaded question in this current environment. I think the thing is that probably the people who can introduce those are parents, right? Is to begin to ask, for example, if we're talking about, resource officers and, they're here, but why are they in our schools versus others? But then also asking the questions about, are we overusing them? And are these things that would normally result in criminal prosecution, or are these things that the school would normally have to handle on their own? And what are some of the remediation things that we can do within our schools? So I think sometimes those are the best people who can ask our parents, but I also think it's always that, if you're saying we're doing this to keep our schools safe, what are other things that we can do that then don't always rise to the level of criminal involvement, and be open to kind of say, where's this middle ground? But parents can say it more than educators.
Wonderful. Thank you. Any considerations for choosing to, or how to acknowledge system concerns in a report that a court would get that might account for, say, disparate arrests, for example?
Yeah, and I actually have. I do that. There are some states, I know mine included, that have their own risk measures that they'll talk about, stuff like, high risk area. And so I will kind of address the difficulty in adolescent choosing where they live. And then I'll say, however, this child is also involved in A, B, and C, which, in spite of the fact that they live in this high risk area because of over policing, because of poverty, and I'll kind of name some of these social determinants of health and their impact on kind of making this area a high crime area. This child has X, Y, and Z. But I always will say, children don't have the option on where they live. And yes, this is an area where there is increased levels of poverty and lack of jobs, which influence a lot of times when people are making decisions to engage in criminal activity. I oftentimes will, again, when we talk about this child is not doing well in school, I'll say, one of the concerns is this child has been noted as there's been learning concerns. However, there are lack of resources within their school district to better address their educational needs, or even to identify them. Parent does, in talking to parents, no one has even talked to them about navigating the system because of lack of resources and funding. So I will kind of put those pieces in there. It does not negate the reality of the situation. It just puts things into context, and also says this is a place for intervention. And so sometimes it's, the judge will say, I want the probation officer to work with mom on identifying how to get this child tested and see if they need an IEP, because the school is required to do this. So I'll do, or lack of access to mental health. I'll talk about families' weariness with systems and why they were not engaged. And sometimes I have families actually talk about seeing you know, seeing kind of the filming of, you know, police brutality and how they don't trust these systems. And this is why, you know, when they told him to stop, he didn't. And so we talk about the problem that he didn't, but then we also talk about issues and we name it as anxiety, right? That this was not oppositional. Sometimes it's anxiety, it was fear. And so how, if, you know, in talking to the child, that cultural piece of it is asking, and when the child starts talking about fear, we name it as, you know, Johnny reported that he's afraid of the police and, you know, he didn't want blah, blah, blah. So he ran, right? And so it wasn't necessarily as much resisting. And so we have to acknowledge it as anxiety versus you wanted to acknowledge it as general criminal and oppositional.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that perspective and those considerations there. I know that you have some other slides of content. If there were any take-home messages or anything there that you wanted to share, I'd be happy to open that to you here.
Absolutely. And I'll just kind of look at these is that we just want to make sure that we incorporate these pieces in these, you know, when we're having these conversations, we want to talk about how they're viewing these systems, how they're experiencing the world around cultural oppression and marginalization. But we also want to have positive racial and ethnic identity experiences. We want to utilize resources, and everybody can have the slides. And there's actually a book on one of them that's designed for Black males that kind of addresses some of these issues in their lives, but comes from a very positive racial identity perspective, because we know research talks about that as a protective factor, specifically for juvenile justice involved youth who are from communities of color, is if they have a positive racial and ethnic identity. We want to make sure that we look at whatever those supports are within their community that are available to them and have services around them. We are quick to say, you have to quit this because you have to go to therapy at this time. And my thing is, but if they're involved in something that's positive, why are we taking that away because we've decided that therapy needs to happen at 3 o'clock? We also talk about the arts and expression and utilizing those various ways of expression that work for them. And then we want to talk about issues of affirmation and resistance, just this idea of empowering them around being that social change if they're ready to do so. How can they better improve their community by making good choices and giving them the opportunity to do that? Community service shouldn't be do community service. We like to throw that one out too. We need to identify things within their community that matter to them and have that be the options for their community service versus saying, oh, go to the food bank that's out here in this area because we have an agreement. And so let's look at what are the community centers, the community activities in your area that matter to you. And if we're doing community service, making sure that it's things that are actually impacting them and that they can see as positive in their own communities. And that's me. I finished.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Dent, Tyffani, for a very, very helpful, thorough presentation here. The comments here just keep rolling in about how much people are learning. People are asking like what's some strategies graduate students can use to even get more exposure to this during their required coursework.
I will, and if you want me to, I will send you there. All the graduate students in psychology should look at the APEX guide. Specifically, there's a resource from APA around kind of social justice and well as culturally informed work, and how graduate students should hold all of us who are leading their education accountable for making space for them to become more informed in this area. And I can send it to you, Anthony, and you can forward it as needed.
Wonderful. Thank you. And as someone who also grew up in the 98 degrees kind of time frame and all that, I definitely appreciate the graduate students coming in and keeping the foundation and the fire going for all of this. Yes. That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series talk. We hope to see you next week with Dr. Jill Levinson talking about trauma-informed care in forensic mental health assessment. And until then, we hope you have a fantastic rest of the week and take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.